Ladies and gentlemen, can I welcome you here tonight to this event under the auspices of British Government at LSE. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you here and our guests who are going to discuss the History Manifesto, this new book, manifesto, by Joe Guldi and David Armitage, a book that addresses the question, how should historians speak truth to power? And perhaps more importantly, why does it matter? I hope that in tonight's discussion, conversation, we will get an answer to both of those questions, and many, many more. How we're going to proceed is Joe and David. David first will present the main argument, outline the argument of the book for you, and then Simon will respond, and then there'll be plenty of time to involve the audience in a wider debate. So it's slightly different from our normal public lectures, and we'll have rather a longer time for question and answer and engagement across the floor. I think that's a very important part of tonight. Can I just then introduce the panel? David Armitage is the Lloyd C. Blankfein Professor of History and Chair of the Department of History at Harvard University. He's author of numerous books, the most recent of which, at least that I know of, is Foundations of Modern International Thought. But he's published widely on international history. Joe Guldi is Assistant Professor of History at Brown University. I did make a note of this. So, right. She specializes in the history of capitalism, land use, and the design of computational tools for visualizing large numbers of texts, in particular paper machines, which gets a mention importantly as part of the book. So here we have the connection of technology and history in ways that are interesting, challenging, controversial. We will be discussing that. The discussant, or the leading discussant tonight, is Simon Szreter, Professor of History and Public Policy at St John's College, Cambridge. And he's here also representing the History and Policy Group. Simon's the author of numerous books on modern social and economic history of the family, gender, demography, and so on. And the History and Policy Group is an interesting collaboration between the Institute for Contemporary History at some place called King's College London and the University of Cambridge. But more importantly, it is concerned with addressing or speaking to politicians, journalists, civil servants, policymakers, and embedding the practice of history and providing the benefits of history to those important figures. So I think the panelists should provide insights and questions that will have a bearing on many different activities that are core to the remit of this place, the LSE. And it's nice, just by way of closing, that we are here at the LSE to do this book launch. A number of important historical LSE figures get a mention in the book. The Webbs, R.H. Tawney, but most recently, the director, Craig Calhoun, I think features on the penultimate page of the argument. So once again, it's a delight to have you all here. It's a great pleasure to have this debate about how historians should speak truth to power and why it matters. So without going on too long, can I invite David to begin by making his presentation? You can either come up here, that would be best. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that very generous introduction, and thank you to the LSE as a whole for your hospitality for this first Broadway performance of the History Manifesto. Joe and I were in California last week, where we did off-Broadway and then off-Broadway at Berkeley, but this is the real launch, for exactly the reasons, actually, more seriously, that Paul said, that it's not a total coincidence that we mentioned Beatrice and Sidney Webb, R.H. Tawney and Craig Calhoun at the beginning and the end of the book, that the tradition of public engagement by the social sciences, including history, is something that we attempt to excavate in the book, something that we want to promote again in the book, but something also that we believe has, at least in other quarters of the world, been something of a broken contract, that the human sciences, among which we count history itself, have not always been as engaged with broader public problems as the academics of the LSE, and in particular the founders of the LSE. And so just to give you a flavor of the manifesto, and then Joe will fill in more of the detail in just a moment, it's worth reflecting what manifestos do. A good manifesto should probably do three things. It should diagnose something, it should propose something, and then it should mobilize people on the basis of the diagnosis and the proposal. So what do we diagnose, what do we propose, and how do we hope to mobilize people? We diagnose what we call a crisis of short-termism, a broader crisis of short-termism in public culture, not just in Britain or in the United States, but throughout the world. A retreat to ever narrower timescales, the quarterly reporting of corporations, the 6 months through to at most 7 years of electoral cycles, intersecting electoral cycles, and the way in which policy is formed around very narrow horizons, the way in which public policy and the information that goes into public policy is also necessarily constrained by those very narrow timescales, and the way in which, therefore, almost all aspects of our lives as citizens of democracies with, again, these competing narrow timescales. Anyone who has ever been under the care of an NGO or an other international organization will be under the rod of 2 to perhaps 5-year funding timescales, that in almost every aspect of our public lives, policy is made on very short-term horizons. That's our larger diagnosis. We also say in the book that you might think that one of the places that you would look for a cure for short-termism might be universities. Universities are some of the longest-lasting and most enduring human institutions, perhaps apart from religious institutions. The average half-life of a business corporation is somewhere between 50 and 75 years. We can all think of examples of universities which are not just 100 years old, or 500 years old, or even 1,000 years old, but some in South Asia or China which are even older than that. Universities are invested in the long-term and long-term thinking, long-term research, but also the protection of long-term traditions and the questioning, the critical questioning of those long-term traditions as well. If we look to history departments in particular, to narrow our focus to the focus we take in the History Manifesto itself, we diagnose in the book a retreat to short-termism from roughly 1975 until the very early part of the 20th century. A retreat that is to narrower timescales, what we call in the book roughly biological timescales of between 5 and 50 years. Any historians in the room remember your first book, your PhD dissertation, your first article? How many years did that cover? How long did you want it to be? You wanted to cover 150 years, but your supervisor said, no, focus on those 2 years or those 6 months. We've all had that experience. And so we diagnose a retreat away from the long term in history and then propose a return to what the French historian Fernand Braudel famously called la longue durée, or as we say in English, the longue durée. That's what we think we should be going back to. Timescales of 100 years, 500 years, 2,000 years, depending on the problem at hand. And we diagnose this not simply as a utopian prospect, though we talk in the book very strongly about the necessity of utopian thinking for shaping multiple futures, but actually observing the return of the longue durée across multiple domains of history. Intellectual history, social history, military history, cultural history, economic and social history, of course, has been one of the areas at the LSE, at Cambridge and elsewhere, which has kept alive the longue durée when other fields have retreated from it. But we see this as a practical proposal to return to the longue durée in the sense that many historians within and also beyond the academy are returning or have been returning to the longue durée. And really our proposal is that we should encourage this larger movement, we should encourage others to join this movement in order to mobilize historians as we call them in the book, critical human scientists. That is, those who are engaged in a critical social science directed at human activity, but also human interaction with the non-human world as well. Environmental history, of course, is an innately longue durée subject, which is central to some of the key examples of the new longue durée that we deal with in the book itself. In order to give encouragement to those who are already engaged in critical longue durée projects, but also in some ways to make a world safe, in particular for younger scholars who wish to do more ambitious projects over longer timescales, treating bigger questions using larger troves of data, especially the large troves of data now available digitally to us, in order to pursue some of the most critical questions of our time. And Joe will talk about those in just a moment. What we want, therefore, is to mobilize historians, young especially, but also older historians, perhaps, like myself, to join this larger movement towards the longue durée, to alert our various funders and masters, deans, administrators, those who hold the purse strings, public and private, of universities around the world, to take history seriously, again, as a discipline which can inform larger public debates about central critical questions, indeed questions which can only be understood in a long-term historical context. And so the aim of the book is somewhat polemical, energetic, feisty is one word that's already been used about it in reviews, is to stir up debate. Precisely as Paul said, we very much welcome conversation. One of our stipulations when we presented the book proposal to presses, in particular to Cambridge University Press, who've done a spectacular job of producing this very beautiful book, was that the book should be open access on first publication. If you've not already visited the website for the book, historymanifesto.cambridge.org, please do so. You will find a free PDF download, which you can distribute as widely as you wish, and we certainly hope you will distribute it extremely widely. There's also an HTML text, which allows for dialogue and annotation, not just for each chapter and each section, but also for each paragraph. There's a forum, there's a blog. Follow the hashtag History Manifesto on Twitter. Follow History Manifesto, 2 words, on Facebook and Twitter as well. You'll find there's a lot going on there. If anyone is live tweeting, please rev up the pace here this evening. We want to have as many people outside and inside the room engaged in this conversation. This is unlike most history books. We aim not to close off every exit for discussion, but to open up every avenue for conversation. And that's what we crave. We look forward to hearing from you. Therefore, I shall shut up and pass it over to my collaborator and co-author, Joe Guldi.
Hi, I want to take a slightly different approach than David and summarize for you parts of our argument in miniature, and in doing so, sketch out the way a historian looks backwards at the 20th century and looks forward at the 21st. So if we put into perspective, I want to put into perspective two events, put two events in dialogue and do what historians do, which is to measure and talk about how we understand change over time. And those two moments are the moment when the old longue durée disappeared, a moment around 1968, a moment of bouleversement in the social sciences more generally, the ranks of the disciplines being reconfigured, the way that we thought about history was being reconfigured. And then I want to bring that into comparison with the moment around us, the events that have happened in the university since 2000, another moment of great revolution, but the revolutions are from extremely different angles, no longer post-colonialism, but more an IT revolution, the results of globalization, the results of free trade. another moment, another opportunity for turning over the ranks of the disciplines and re-understanding what the purposes of a university education are, where the applicability of the social sciences are, and then how the different forms of knowledge, computational sciences, social sciences, and the humanities should come together. Why are they useful? So let me talk to you a little about these two events, because this is really the conversation out of which this book came. Where are we right now? This is a practical conversation. And as we lay it out in the book's introduction, this question, where am I right now in time and space, this is a question not just for historians. It's a question that all of us ask. We ask it first in the family setting. We ask it as institutions, as governments. We ask it as citizens. We ask it as activists all the time. Where am I in time and space? What are the institutions around me? How are they changing? And of course they were asking it in 1968, which is why it makes that year an excellent anchor for how to look backwards in order to look forwards. So if we look back to 1968, we look at the confluence of the rise of economics as a discipline consulting with public policy, the rise of economists. And we're not the first historians to see this. Other historians who we point to in the footnotes of our book have pointed to the 1960s and 1970s as an era of advancing U.S. foreign policy, when Latin American country after Latin American country, Asian country after Asian country found it necessary to employ an economist as the advisor closest to the president, an economist commenting on every act of government in the newspapers. And that was simply not true if you looked back a decade or two before that, if you looked back to the 1940s and 1950s. And we sketch out some of that evolving ecosystem of the role of economics as a discipline commenting on public policy in our book. And we say, look, if you look at foreign policy and you look at public policy in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1950s, the chief intellectuals on stage at an event of this kind asked to comment about the expanding welfare state, the role of housing in the state. They would have been trained historians commenting on history in the longue durée, individuals like R.H. Tawney, like Fernand Braudel, like Louis Mumford. And we go through these generations. And again, we're not the first historians to have made these observations. It's well established in the American historiography that there was something called a public intellectual from the humanities reigning supreme in American public policy conversations in the 1940s and 1950s, having a conversation about class and race and their participation in an expanding age of abundance and housing, and where policy should go, how policy should take its direction. But economics was changing, the order of the social sciences was changing in the 1950s and 1960s, and this produced something that contemporaries referred to as a crisis of the humanities in the 1960s. Try an Ingram search, try it when you get back, the crisis of the humanities. The first time that language pops up is in the 1960s, and it's often in debates in which the leaders of the National Endowment for Humanities, the major grant fund-writing institution of the United States, are making grants and talking about what they should fund. What should we fund in an era of civil rights? The NEH in the 1960s had been writing grants to professors of English literature to write new programs of education that would be brought into public housing, that would be brought into the American inner cities, that would take African Americans and at the high school level encourage African American youths to participate in reenactments of Shakespeare, and then to have public conversations about what the humanities meant to everyday life. And there was revolt. This was contested on both sides. There was a revolt of young professors who had trained in the archives affiliated with American institutions of the humanities, like the Folger Institute, who did not want that form of humanities for the public humanities, to mark their education and their advancement through the ranks of academia. They wanted archival exactment. They wanted specificity in time and place, exact footnotes building upon generations of scholarship before them, placing another brick in the wall of knowledge. Now, we talk in great detail about what else we think was happening in 1968, how the bottom fell out of the PhD job market, how the ways of advancing in the academy changed, how budding historians were drawn into the front ranks of politics, were protesting in the evenings in labor disputes and in feminist marches, and then going back to the archives to research. And we talk about all of the reasons by which historians look backwards at that moment, at the narrowing on time and space that their research took, how they went from macro history to micro history, in part to make good on these promises of gender, race, and class, to restore working class voices to the archive, to restore the subaltern perspective to particular moments where it had been utterly eradicated by the nature of writing itself as a discipline. So in 1968, a very interesting moment, if you're interested in how the disciplines think of their relationship to the public. And this narrowing and narrowing of time spans that David Armitage has just been talking about was built on political conversations and political involvement. There's no other way to understand it. Very contested disputes. So we review some of those in the first 2 chapters of our books. The transition from the longue durée to what we call the short past. How did that happen and why? It's a deeply imbricated story. So what was going on with the social sciences in around 1968 was a massive overturning. And then what we think, if we look through that same perspective at modern events, at what's going on, where are we right now, compare that event to more recent events in the university, to what's been happening to shape the university and its dialogue with public policy at places like the LSE, or like at Harvard or at Brown, where I'm from, since 2000. And if we try to understand this event, as the historians of the future will look back and they'll try to imagine who we were right here, right now, in this auditorium, how our lives have changed over the last 10 years, how our hiring has changed over the last 10 years, how our politics has changed over the last 10 years. I think they're going to talk about 3 things. I think they're going to talk about a revolution in information technology. We're living through an information revolution. All of us know this. The rise of computers in government, the rise of big data has a very long story stretching back for at least 40 years. But it's not until the rise of the mashup of peer-to-peer information creating a globalized world, what was called the Web 2.0 about 5 years ago, that libraries and archives and governments and Google became involved in mass digitization projects that utterly transformed forever the kinds of information about the past which every man, woman, and child has access to. You can run an ingram. You can run an ingram which measures all words in the English language corpus from the Google book search. You can look at the rise and rise of each word at a time that transformed the 19th century. When I just told you to go back and look at an ingram for the crisis of the humanities, and see it take off in 1968. That is a visualization that you can run in an instant that measures all of the books that Google knows about and gives you a pretty good dead reckoning. Big data in the service of understanding how our institutions and our thinking changed. Now, we talk in the book about the other kinds of software that are available, some of which we have invented ourselves, others of which are being used by colleagues in econ and political policy and climate science. But there's no doubt that the rise of big data is with us and it's changing how we learn. And it's absolutely there in the humanities, it's absolutely there in the social sciences, and it is on the point of transforming how historians do their work. Masses and masses of data at scale. And for historians, the kind of scale that matters is sometimes geographical, more places and more times, sometimes more information, more words, more books, but it's often scale of time. So we think that that scale is being driven by this moment in IT to become bigger and bigger, more and more time measured by these new forms of technology. The second force which is converging into this moment at the present is imminent political crises. Now, of course, every moment has its imminent political crises and its emergencies, but the imminent political crises of our time are distinguished in a curious way. Many of them are crises in the long term. Think about climate change. We did not start climate change. Depending on whose model you look at, it was started either in the agrarian revolution or in the industrial revolution. The results are cumulative. But it is irreversible, and it will be with our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. And the policy questions about how to manage climate change are necessarily historical in their nature. And they take the form of a series of counterfactuals. Should we stop industrialization in its tracks, aim for sustainability over growth? Is that even realistic? Has that ever been done before? Or do we need a kind of massive intervention of collaborative governments, which we need to look backwards for examples, backwards to the New Deal, backwards to putting a man on the moon for examples of how a government could change things on a massive systematic scale? So we're suddenly all of us very interested in counterfactuals and long-term thinking and long-term history and long-term futures. And we argue in the book that there are two other political crises that mirror climate change in their long-term nature. These are inequality and international governance. And in the realm of international governance, we have to look back to the 1960s or before to tell the story of the United Nations, the League of Nations, to look at a pre-Cold War order that's something other than the failures of the free market for an example of how to move forward. We talk about inequality and that poverty has been off the picture from many debates since the Reagan-Thatcher era, and that static state policies suggested by particular social science models as an alternative to the welfare state now need counterfactual thinking, including the kind of counterfactual thinking now being pioneered by economists who have taken a historical turn, economists like Thomas Piketty. What happens if you don't take Kuznets as mandate and you start looking for other more egalitarian traditions out of history, other more egalitarian policies designed to eradicate inequality? What happens if you look in those directions? We see that that's another long-term question, which is inspiring scholars everywhere. So the third force that I think is happening now to make a new event in the overturning of the structures of education and social science around us is challenges to the structure of the university. So challenges to the structure of the university are all around us. There are proposals proposals for alternative forms of education that strip down universities to a form of free market exchange with digitized streamcast lectures and online chat rooms are everywhere. Open up the newspaper. There's Phoenix University, Minerva University, MOOCs are everywhere we hear, possibly making the lecture outdated. Or do we just need more up-to-date and timely lectures? Well, our answer, we weigh in on some of those questions, not all of them. We are not promoting the demise of the university, but certainly these questions preoccupy chancellors and the presidents of universities and their boards of directors, even if faculty would prefer not to talk about them. And so they're shaping the future around us. We are being asked as faculty, as graduate students, even as undergraduates, to imagine and articulate what's so essential about coming face to face in rooms like this, and to prepare answers about how it is that the social sciences and humanities are relevant. We're being asked to justify our existence in a changing political scene. So this is, if we step back to what I've been talking about, the moment of 1968, the moment of the university since 2000, these two events structure a contingent answer about the humanities, about history more specifically, about the social sciences, a contingent answer about where the university is now. And a contingent answer, this is not a universalist or an existential or an essentialist argument about the humanities, even a traditional one that's based on classical learning. This is a contingent answer about three political, technological watershed moments that are rocking some of the oldest institutions, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, centuries-old institutions around us, and they demand new answers about what we use education and social science and our research for. So they're on everybody's mind. And our job in launching a manifesto is to gather some of our colleagues who have been talking to these issues, talking to climate change in policy, looking for models, to look backwards at some older examples that can inform the present, the Webbs, the Fabians, Braudel, Mumford. Other historians thought about these things. Does the long-term past inform policy? Does the long-term past inform the now? And it's essential that we have a debate about this, that we raise these questions. In the last historiographical work to take these questions seriously, how precisely does history inform policy? It was probably Neustadt and May. This is the text that keeps on coming up in our conversations. Maybe Simon will have more to say about this. But Neustadt and May and their examples of the ways that history necessarily, historical thought, historical comparisons necessarily inform the way that politicians make decisions, specifically in war, for better or for worse. They're always analogizing. So what would happen if we took seriously this mandate to analogize with purpose, to analogize about this present moment, specifically around climate change, inequality, and international governance? What would the work be there? What would we want to aim at? So we want to hear from you. What is this moment? What is this event about? Are you persuaded? What will you be doing for the public future? So we have only 60 minutes to have this conversation, and as David mentioned, we have purposely tried to integrate ourselves, for better or for worse, with this vast peer-to-peer social networking Web 2.0 universe in which we find ourselves. This is livecast. We have tweeting. We will go back and read the tweets ourselves tonight.
Thank you.
And we hope to find you in the online forum. We hope to meet you there. And you can comment line by line on the text on this website that Cambridge University Press has graciously built for us. So thank you so much. Thank you, Simon. Thank you to the LSE. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Joe. You'll be pleased to hear I'm not proposing a line-by-line commentary on the book. I think this is a book that really did need to be written, and it does need to be read by all professional historians. It asks what should be the public role of history today. Starting with the conceit of an opening line invoking the haunting spectre of a certain previous famous manifesto of 1848, there are plenty of other memorable one-liners here, which I can see taking their place on general historical exam papers of the near future, such as the very next second sentence in the book. We live in a moment of accelerating crisis that is characterized by the shortage of long-term thinking. Discuss. I think it's going to be mined by examiners. Among the many strengths of this engagingly written book, it is also refreshingly decisive about precisely what the authors see as the three greatest of the current public policy problems facing us. They are climate change, rising economic inequalities, and global governance. Colleagues in the historical profession will inevitably, and with some justice, find much to dispute, much that irritates or even grates. Omelettes and breaking eggs come to mind. But I do hope that in receiving and reviewing this book, fellow historians will not simply indulge in the profession's abiding vice of sniping at details while failing to see the wood for the trees. I do hope that they will engage critically with the positive challenge issued by the History Manifesto and will generously recognise the honest effort made here to address crucial issues that the profession as a whole has rather ducked for a generation. In my view, the strongest general argument both for the importance of bringing history into dialogue with policy and for historians to take it as their civic duty to contribute to this expansion in contemporary public discourse proposed by the History Manifesto is that history is already there all the time in the policy formulating process. The only question is what kind of history is going to be used by decision makers. The policy world and politicians invoke history at every turn, but they rarely consult historians. Now, this would be political suicide today if it was economic policy without advice from any economists. But we, the historians, are the only ones who, I think, can change this. It's my job here to offer some debating points and different views from those expressed in the book. But I wish to start by acknowledging my admiration and gratitude to the authors for a courageous initiative. In the brief time available, I'll offer a couple of general points for consideration and, because we're historians, some attempt at empirical illustration. My first point in opening this discussion would be to question whether the headline diagnosis of a pervading short-termism, along with a shortage of long-term thinking, is quite the critical issue here, either among historians or in the public policy world. The primary thrust of the manifesto is to argue for professional historians to return to la longue durée, championed by the profession's international patron saint, the great French historian Fernand Braudel. For Guldi and Armitage, quote, the extension of historians' timescales we both diagnose and recommend in this book. They support the practicality of this by advocating new forms of research, exploiting digitalised big data by historians using the power of new tools, such as the paper machine's extension of Zotero, developed and deployed by Jo Guldi herself. They mention approvingly the growing field of environmental history and its debate over the new geological era term, the Anthropocene. Also deep history, that's 40,000 years. And big history, that's 13.8 billion years, which apparently is the kind of number that attracts the attention of Bill Gates himself. He likes talking with people who only deal in billions, I guess. However, later on page 112 to be exact, the manifesto talks, I think very relevantly, about what it calls the dirty longue durée. They identify several influential examples of such false, teleological, or essentially deterministic long-termism in current public policy discourse. Firstly, narratives relating to climate change which tend to predict unavoidable apocalyptic collapse in the misguided belief that this is the only way to mobilise public opinion. Secondly, the so-called historical insights of path dependency in economics, or thirdly, of some aspects of evolutionary biology, each of which claim that history matters, but it only mattered once, and deep in the irrecoverable past, setting an entire society or region or the whole species on a course towards the necessity of gendered hierarchy and inequality, perhaps, or towards the superiority of free markets and accumulative capitalism. So there is, in fact, quite a bit of long-termism about already. My question is whether a focus on the long term is truly the antidote to a plethora of short-termism, as far as historians are concerned. Or is it not simply the other side of that myopic coin? Short sight and long sight are equally impaired. Isn't the real strength of history in the very full attention that it gives to the neglected medium term? Braudel himself identified a medium temporality between the froth and fireflies of political events and the histoire quasi-immobile of physical environments. History pays great attention to the interaction between both long and short and the medium term because its practitioners are highly respectful in their historicist methodology of inquiry to three key aspects of society and of change. These are 1, context, 2, process, and 3, power. 1, context. What did things mean to people in the past and what were their motivations? 2, process. Careful attention to sequence matters crucially in establishing causation. 3, power. Conflict and negotiation due to differences of position, interest and resources is integral to understanding exactly how change occurs, and these differences often need to be actively researched by historians because power hides and it also conceals, and because posterity, which is another word for the victors, likes to forget. As Guldi and Armitage emphasise, good history recovers the contingent alternatives in the past and the multiple levels and agencies of causation, and so alerts us to the prospective indeterminacy of the future. If we think the past is a smooth, ineluctable teleological line to the superiority of the present, our uncertainty about the future and its prospective openness seems alien and daunting, even frightening, and those peddling dogmatic or fundamentalist certainties seem attractive. The crucial lesson from learning about history from historians, and not from biologists or economists, is that our future right now, today, remains prospectively open, subject to our politically negotiated choices, not determined by the impersonal forces of globalisation or of our genes. Modern British history quite clearly shows, for instance, that the rise to preeminence in public discourse of a moralising individualism dressed up as the inevitable and unavoidable competitive laws of a market economy has come and gone before. Modern British society and its globalising economy flourished without any such dominant ideology from the time of the Reformation through the Industrial Revolution to the 1820s. From the 1830s until the 1900s, when income and wealth inequality peaked, in fact in 1913, at its previously highest recorded level before the current coalition government's record, Adam Smith's ideology of competitive individualism held sway in that Victorian Britain, where the factory and the workhouse became the main institutions of the economy. Though increasingly subject to challenge from Marx and Engels, from organised labour, and more prosaically but interestingly in the policies of some large provincial municipalities from the 1870s onwards, it was not until the first half of the 20th century that the Victorian ideology rapidly lost ground, disappearing entirely as a guide to public policy from the late 1930s until the 1980s. It has now been dominant once again as neoliberalism for about a 3 or 4 decade period, just as it was for such a length of time between the 1830s and 1870s. Once again, it has produced pain and penury for the workers, unregulated destruction of the environment, but massively increasing wealth for an elite. So if the competitive forces of globalisation today somehow seem to force workers' wages ever downward and the bonuses of bankers ever upward, history can show us exactly how economic elites have repeatedly used their position, power, the law and the institutions of the state to exploit others in this way. But it also shows us periods when this has not been the case and how these less exploitative arrangements were achieved and made effective through the actions of others. History shows that nothing is inevitable. And this is a perspective in this particular case requiring the linkage in history of short, long and medium terms. My final point is about practicalities. For history to engage with public policy, it has to be a dialogue, a dialectical process. This is not something very much discussed in the manifesto. If we want to encourage public policy makers to engage with historicism as a way of thinking about the world and how change occurs, then we historians need to think about the needs and goals of those personally accountable for public policy advice and implementation. History can learn from policy, and indeed it must at least understand what the pressing policy issues are as perceived by the policymakers. This is certainly not so that historians can start engaging in careers of applied policy-relevant government-funded impact research projects and promptly cease to be historians. The questions we ask about the past must come from our discipline's own evolving critical intellectual agendas. Otherwise, we have nothing independent to offer the policy world, and why should they listen to historical elaborations of what they already know? This is not then a matter of historians aping the policy world, but of historians learning how to exert maximum influence over policymakers with their independent insights and their distinct historicist approach by knowing how to talk to policy. We need to train historians not in researching for a public policy agenda, but in communicating to public policy the enormous variety of valuable insights from the research they conduct into history. This, I think, is the field of operations where the institution I founded in 2002, History and Policy, with a number of colleagues, has been operating. This is an institution controlled by historians, History and Policy, seeking to insert their different voice and perspectives into policy. And this leads to a final point about practicalities. I can certainly sign up to the importance of historians making much more effort to ensure that their skills, knowledge and understandings of the relationship between past, present and future are fully taken on board in deliberations that have informed public policy. But my experience since 2002 is that this requires more than stimulating and challenging books, including long-term refreshing insights, valuable though these are. It requires also institutions with public profile to promote such engagement, and that has been the purpose of History and Policy. But it is not something currently with recognised funding in the HE sector. Yes, that was a plea for resources. To conclude, Joe Guldi and David Armitage wish to invigorate and stimulate a conversation among historians and others about public engagement. And it is certainly one that I believe we in the history profession should now be joining. So, to mirror the opening line of the History Manifesto, I concur. Arise, historians, cast off your chains. You have much to lose. You have much to lose, but you have much to gain.
Okay, let's get the argument going. If you could put your hands up, and then please wait until a microphone comes, because we are recording this, so if you try and ask your question without the microphone, we don't hear. I'm going to take about 3 or 4 questions at a time. So I'll start with the gentleman at the front, the lady over there in the red top and cardigan, and keep your hands up. Gentleman in the middle on the upper floor, blue shirt, see him? Those 2 will start.
Okay, thank you.
Perhaps you can introduce yourself as well.
Yes, I'm Get Your Share on Twitter. Thank you. History is written from Cambridge, Oxford and Harvard through the established media and increasingly new media. Does this not make job titles from these same schools a profound conflict of interest and a self-feeding system? And in this self-feeding system, we're not doomed to watch history repeat itself. If there is a step on to a history of manifesto, is it not the self-analysis of the people that write history and the people that watch and record history, like yourselves? Thank you.
Hi. First of all, thank you for the talk, and I'm really excited that the History Manifesto is open access. So you opened your talk talking about the decline of the historian, public intellectual, and the rise of the economists. And that's something that is kind of has been noticed by many people. And I often think about it in relation to the rise of statistics, which got going in the late 70s, 80s, and economics, slow imperialism across the humanities has been kind of well, our stats are better than yours. So how has the rise of statistics affected the history profession, and how do you see it affecting it in the future?
Thank you. Could I just remind you, please introduce yourself. It'd be good to know who's a student of history, a professional historian, who's an economist. Anyway.
I'm Melanie, and I'm an economist, or I'm studying economics.
Thank you. Very helpful. Right.
Hello, Alistair Anderson, UCL Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis, also a history graduate of LSE from 1983. I'm very interested in this return to the long-term history, but my question is this: how do you position yourselves in relation to the clear dynamics movement, especially given Professor Turchin's suggestion in his 2007 paper that the appropriate division of labour is that historians should concern themselves with what is particular and contextual, while long-term generalizations and theorizing should be reserved for the clear-dynamicists. Basically, that history can't be reformed as a discipline in this subject. Thank you.
Okay, you've all taken notes, 3 rather complex questions, which I'm not going to attempt to summarize. Who'd like to leave off? David, do you want to start?
I will definitely duck the second question about statistics. That's very much Joe's area of expertise, and she'll be able to speak to that. And perhaps suture together the first question and the third question in terms of self-analysis of those, especially in established institutions, about the future of history, and then the different ways in which history is being reimagined on the short term and the long term. And as you're quoting, the possibility that the twain shall never meet, that there will never be the happy medium, the moyenne durée, the balance between the long and the short that Simon was also talking about. This book arises very much from the self-analysis and self-questioning of 2 historians at institutions where, in my case in particular, I spent the last 2 years as chair of my department, thinking about the future of graduate students in my department, thinking about the future of the undergraduate curriculum, looking at declining enrollments in my department, not unusual at all in history departments across the world, not unusual, of course, across humanities departments across the world, and trying to concentrate my colleagues' attention on why were those enrollments declining, where were students going, talking to our undergraduates and our graduate students and saying, what do you need from a history degree, whether a BA degree or a PhD degree? What is it that you come to understand from history? And even talking to students who are not in our department to ask them, why did you not, when you could make a decision, why did you not decide to come and do history? So a sense of crisis, a sense of a need to reform, a sense of purpose in institutions which draw together large numbers of students and faculty in precisely that kind of self-analysis certainly drove my impetus in thinking about the future of the university, the future of history departments, at a moment where both private and public institutions on both sides of the Atlantic and around the world need to engage in that kind of self-analysis. And it's therefore not just a question of history, an internal question for history with a capital H about where we might go, but to come up with more hopeful and optimistic views than perhaps the rather divided one that you quoted. I didn't sense that you necessarily shared that analysis yourself, Alistair, but that sense of the incompatibility between the two is something I think that we elaborate reasons in the book why those two things can and must be brought together. This is not a polemic against microhistory in favor of macrohistory. It's precisely about the necessity of inserting the two into productive dialogue with each other, since that dialogue has in some sense broken down and needs to be reintegrated.
Joe, do you add something?
Yeah, sure. I'd like to talk to the first and the third question. And the first question, I'm really delighted that that's the first question on the table. And my answer is going to differ a little from David's, because David is speaking to this audience as a former administrator, and he comes here as the last chair of the Harvard History Department. And I come to history and to the writing of the History Manifesto from a slightly different position. I'm an assistant professor, but I'm a former activist. And so the question of co-optation, a critique of privilege, is really important. It's something that's very important to many people in the world. It's very important to some people in these institutions. And critique is one position of dialogue about it. Another position of dialogue about it is solidarity, is the necessity for allies within institutions who use their position of privilege in solidarity with other people who are trying to change policy. And this is a position that many policymakers in the best of all possible worlds are interested in. And it is a solid form of solidarity that many historians in labor history and women's history have traditionally been extremely interested in, and even in the form of doing something like deconstructing the article or the book as a way of communicating, and instead going on walking tours where the community tells the story of the history of the community to itself. So in an age of digital history, I think all of these paths are extremely important. And one of the directions that we point to is that there are different ways of doing digital history. There are different techniques of doing big data depending on who you think is out there who might be interested. One of the forms that digital history has taken over the last 5 years is informed by the history of informed by the tradition of scholarly articles, where we want to do things like have really robust, statistically correct visualizations and maps. Well, if you're aware that there's a Twitterverse out there, that if you're aware that there are things like Facebook, and that there are many communities that are connected, and that we have allies in different communities who are not in the university, who care about many of these policy issues, then a different kind of information becomes very interesting. So we talk about Zotero. Zotero is a platform for sharing scholarly information, for sharing data about events in the past that was used by the Occupy activists during Occupy to create the Occupy archive online. So you've got a movement that's in the process of coming into being. They don't have their demands yet, but they're in the process of getting their demands, and you've got a series of events that are happening in real time. So how can you use this platform that was designed by historians for historians to crowdsource that effort? And that's worth looking at. And another example that we hold up in the book is Matthew Connolly's work. Matthew Connolly is visiting the LSE, I believe. He's a historian at Stanford, a historian of public policy in America. And he's made something in his last effort called the declassification engine. And the declassification engine is a map of all of the dark archives in the United States Department of State that have been silenced. So they submit FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests. Send me all of your information on this Vietnam War activist. And then they can tick off how many things have been silenced. And this has mounted a case, we didn't know before they started doing this, has mounted a case that's showing the repression of information over the last 2 presidencies. Yeah. So sorry, to wrap that up, I'm not getting to Melanie's question about statistics. One thing that's worth considering is that the rise of statistics over the last generation of economists has come at the same time. It's coincided with the rise of histories of science, of histories of statistics by folks like Ian Hacking. We have been keeping dancing toe to toe with the economists. Yeah, and maybe I'll wrap that up.
Okay, I'd just be very brief because I know more want to ask questions. Just on the first and second questions, really. History is practiced in universities. History and policy is not in any sense exclusive to Russell Group universities or anything like that. It's 500 current historian members, and the Russell Groups are not overrepresented amongst them. They're from all over the country, and some of them are from abroad. 5,000 or 6,000 Twitter followers who come from all over the place, and I do know that schools and teachers and sixth formers use the website and find it helpful to them. So I don't think history and policy is not about Oxbridge. It's about historians engaging with public policy. It's about getting out of the ivory towers, not kind of trying to stay in them. Statistics, historians have been studying and looking at statistics for a very long time, and the crucial thing about statistics, of course, is not numbers, it's codes and classifications. Statistics are nothing much, the numbers are the trivial, in a sense, part of statistics. The crucial thing in statistics is the coding, the creation of equivalences, and the classifications. And that historians have studied a lot. I've personally studied it a lot, and many others have. And it's crucial. And if you use statistics without being aware of its provenance and the changes in the ways it's constructed over time, if you use data series and so on, you get famous phrase Google. You get rubbish. You can, of course, when numbers exist, you can study them. You can produce indices. You can produce apparent findings. But if you don't pay very careful attention with the skills of a historian to the provenance of the coding and classifications, you could be spinning things that don't really show remotely what you think they show. So historians have been and the field of economic history, which I was glad David mentioned, because I do think if I'd had more time, it would have been, I'm sure you're aware, one of the historiographical slight oddnesses of the book, but it's simply explainable because of the specialisms of its two authors, and you can't write a book like that with multiple authors. Beyond a couple's probably the limit. Is that economic history has been doing an awful lot of what they're advocating. It has never left the long term alone, and it has always looked at data, at statistics. It's been dealing with big data and those problems really for forever. So a lot of that, there is a continuity in the history profession within that subset of it, which is well represented, of course, here at the LSE, and also, as it happens, in Cambridge, where I come from.
Okay, some more questions. Two here, the woman in the scarf, and then the gentleman in the white shirt. So, no, forward, hands up. And then the gentleman in the white shirt. At the front here on the first row, one other. Go for four. Tony Travers. Okay. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a student at the International History Department here. And I just started, so my question might be a bit ignorant. I hope not. I was wondering, do you think that every historian should engage in this practice that you are preaching? Because as far as I see it, historians who write or who write over great spans of time are using work by historians who have engaged within their discipline and who have gone down to the nitty-gritty archives and researched really thoroughly a very small portion of history. And how do you see, I guess, the role of that history in what you're proposing? Thank you.
Thank you. Behind.
Yes, thank you very much for coming. My name is Dror. I got a master's here in History of International Relations and also PGC later on. So I'm actually a school teacher. I'm the head of my history department down in a school in Kent. And my question actually is more focused towards the medium term. So if you think about the professors, 20, 30 years down the line, who would be presumably your students, maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, what do you want them to know, and how do you want them to think?
Thank you. Jack, in the corner here.
Okay. Hello, Jack Tyndall. I was formerly a student of government and history, and I just can't really stay away. One thing I was very pleased to hear about, first and foremost, was the references you made to counterfactuals. I mean, I think it is, from an academic point of view, very important. I mean, I'm rather reminded of Professor Robert Fogel's excellent work that I think he won the Nobel Prize for it on railways and postulating what a world would be like without railways being constructed. But I think the thing that I really took away from what you've been speaking about today was that old Greek proverb that, a society grows great when old men plant trees that they know they're never going to sit in the shade of. So what I would like to know, and I was very tempted from Dr. Guldi's points about the social media, is how in this era of very much a buffet approach to politics, I think, and instant gratification, looking at things via the social media, which I think in some respects is very positive, but how can historians encourage public policymakers to start thinking in terms of generational changes? I think we're getting there with infrastructure, but less so in other areas, rather than just thinking in terms of the electoral cycle.
I'm Tony Travers from the Government Department here at LSE. I was once co-author of a book about the poll tax, the British poll tax, where we discovered, of course, there had been earlier poll taxes, well written up, had no impact, of course, on the government of the day. But still, my point is nothing to do with that. History sees historians imposing or interpreting events that took place in the past and creating a story from them. But of course, because of that, different historians come up with different versions of the past. You can see that particularly with the large number of books produced about the First World War recently, many of them brilliant, but concluding often very, very differently as to what they see and what they can learn from it. Politicians, and the people who make public policy, of course, are involved in a competitive process, and they then look at historians and choose the ones they want. So my question to you is, as the fragmentation that Jack refers to, and we've heard from the platform, occurs, won't it simply mean that politicians, in a slightly consumerist way, will choose from the historians they like, of whom there will be very many more, and that actually, unless there were, and there never could be, a single historical answer to things, we are left with the question that people or politicians, policymakers, will simply choose the historians and the history they want.
Let me abuse my privilege and add my own question. Somebody once said, in the long run, we're all dead. And well, actually, didn't quite say that. But I mean, doesn't that connect with the issue about historians informing policy making? There is some truth to that point of view from the perspective of electoral politics, at least. So whilst you can engage in politics in different ways than electoral politics and policy making is short term. That's why climate change is so problematic. I mean, does that complicate the story? In a sense, you can speak, you can show your manifesto to power, but they're just structured differently. Go on, you answer that first.
They're not like you and me.
Well, it's true.
Joe first.
It's true. Well, we've been having good conversations with colleagues about things like this, and I'm struck by a conversation that I had with an Ottoman historian, and the Ottoman historian said, "No, I like your argument." She hadn't read the book, but we were having a glass of wine. She said, "No, I like your argument. I think that's good. I think it's good. It's good that we should write relevant policy. But our problem as a liberal Middle Eastern historian in the United States is that there are lots of Middle Eastern historians, and policy is really attracted to some ones who I don't agree with." So that's true. Our colleagues in Middle East and Latin America have a lot to say. But there's a consumer problem, in that history can cherry pick policy can cherry pick that it wants, and then there's also a problem of access. So one argument might run, well, if you buy our argument, if you buy the argument of the History Manifesto and you think that policy needs good history, and it needs your kind of history, it needs history with the subaltern included, it needs history of laborers, it needs a history of climate, and that points the finger and says who's responsible. Well, that's a call not for us. We just did our job. We're done. That's for the rest of you to get ready, because there might, if you are a history student or a history graduate student or a history faculty member who has other alternative politics or alternative ideas, a moment might come when a reporter might put the microphone in front of your face and say, the History Manifesto said that you have things to say. What are they? So you might have to get ready, and that might entail some self-examination of one's own position in the world, and the way in which one engages with the present, and the way in which one chooses a subject. So that's a process that we've been quite shy about as an institution for a long time, for some structured reasons. It's not necessarily a part of the historian's DNA that we should be shy about. We've created this effectual culture. And the other thing that brings up for me is a question of access, that policymakers can't get at our opinions if all of the Ottoman historians who do care about gender, race, and class are all publishing behind locked journals. The economists aren't. They have their pre-releases out on REPEC or SSRC or one of these open access platforms. They're on the internet. The policymaker can download it. The minister can download it that afternoon, no problem. Our stuff, they have to buy a book. It has to ship out. They have to subscribe. They have to get a library subscription. We don't do open access. So this whole format thing that we've been talking about, the open access publication of Cambridge University Press, this is actually a quite radical act of Cambridge University Press that other publishers, other institutions, and individuals have to tune into. If you want your things to be read, you have to provide access.
Do you want to say something?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think addressing this sort of issue about, both what Paul and Tony said, and perhaps the other one about generational change and cycles. I mean, I think one has to be careful that one doesn't end up with just simply a counsel of despair for any intellectual or academic, because yes, politics is about self-fulfilling prophecies, people holding ideologies that are self-fulfilling prophecies and trying to make everybody else believe them enough to get them through. And we've seen plenty of that in the last few years in particular. But it doesn't mean that academics of all stripes, but including historians, shouldn't be doing their best to ensure that the ways in which these politicians are judged and to some extent advised does not reflect a more complicated reality that they have to try and deal with and that they have to explain themselves to their electorate with. So I think that you're right that politics is a tough place to go, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't take on tough places to go. And my view with history and policy is that I want historians to be part of that discussion rather than simply not being there at all. If a historian is advising a government department and in an influential way, and I or another historian really disagree with the interpretation they're offering, we can actually dispute that. If no historian is advising anybody, we can't dispute it. If it's just economists, they say, well, what do we want to talk to you about? You're a historian, you can't tell us anything about this. So I think there's perfectly good reasons. Of course, we can't expect history to get some direct main line into the sort of arterial sort of veins of politicians, but I think that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing our very best and talking more widely to a public and their advisors. So I think that, that's and in answer to that very first question, which is a nice one from Emily, I'm very liberal on things that I don't think any historians should be doing what I'm asking other historians to do. There's no compulsion about this. I think that it's an option that historians hopefully will step forward in good numbers, and in history and policy they have, but I would never want to be sort of trying to corral other academics into this activity, that's up to them. Yeah, I think that's probably, I don't want to monopolise this.
History does not produce microwave-ready solutions for policymakers. And I think that's our great weakness at the moment, but it's also a strength that we can capitalize on. And one answer to your question, Emily, that I always pose to my students is when they're doing a piece of research, whether it's an undergraduate research or a PhD or anything in between, is what's the biggest question you can answer with your specific archive, problem, event, historiography? Go deep, dive deep into that particular problem, that particular archive, those particular resources, whatever it may be, but always ask yourself, what's the biggest question that you can illuminate with that particular deep dive? That's the crucial thing, and I think that expands outwards into the question that Draw asked as well. How do we want students to think is exactly what Simon was saying earlier about articulating those scales of complexity, detail, empiricism, dialogue between narrative, analysis, argument, and evidence, which is what we as historians have been trained to do and do, I would say, I think many of us on this panel would say, better than other critical human sciences. That's what we do, that concatenation. It's all very complicated is the motto that should be engraved over every history department. And that, to give more substance to that, we should say it's all very complicated precisely because there are multiple paths, not just that there are different historians who disagree about causality, timelines, evidence, explanation, frame of reference, whatever it may be, but because there are many, many pasts out there, and we each choose to reconstruct one or some of them in our historical studies. We're all counterfactual historians to that extent. I think it's very important to say that. Parche Richard Evans, for instance, counterfactuals are not just for fun. Every time we produce a narrative or an explanation, we have excluded other narratives, other explanations, other frames of reference. Those counterfactuals are lost on the cutting room floor, but all of our history is counterfactual history in that sense. And the crucial thing about insisting there are multiple pasts and it's all very complicated is, again, coming back to one of Simon's points, there are therefore multiple futures as well. That's our critical gift to policymaking, to say multiple futures, nothing is path dependent, nothing is evolutionarily determined in that sense. Almost the first response we got to the History Manifesto when it went live open access on Friday came from a senior policy analyst in the Prime Minister's office in Singapore. And she wrote to me and said, this is absolutely fantastic that you've written this. I've been engaged in dialogue between our office and the Prime Minister's office in Australia about the necessity of embedding more futurists in our policy-making apparatuses at the very highest levels of policy-making. Where do we get those futurists from? We get them among historians. Historians are the best futurists because we recognise the complexity of the past. So again, Parche Sir Tom Devine in the Scottish independence debate over the past few weeks. The future is our period as historians. The future, or we should say, futures are our periods as historians, just as pasts are our periods as historians. Multiple, complex, interlocking, but never path-dependent and never singular.
So quickly, you wanted to come in?
Yes, just a quick question, because we missed Dror's question, and I think that I'm so delighted that a school teacher is asking what the takeaway is. And it meshes beautifully with Simon's comments, either on the importance of listening to the world around us, to the medium term, yes, to all of that. But, I think this listening to policymakers, listening to the world around us, which is essentially what we're advocating. We're not advocating the super longue durée of millennia. We're not big historians. Our longue durée, for both of us, is about 150 years, which is long enough for institutions, long enough to see change. And it's really the curriculum of an average school history class. And I think that historians become re-engaged with contemporary issues when they start by reading the newspaper. You don't have to start by talking to the policymaker. If you aren't friends with Simon already, you start by looking in the newspaper. So the question of where you might start in a school, I would imagine making a connection to the historians who are writing right now, who have been reading the newspaper. And just off the top of my head, the things that have been coming over my desk recently are historians of energy, historians of infrastructure, of food, of nutrition. And all of these policies are ripe. They're changing right now. What is the history of prison policy in this country or other countries, the history of detainments. And I think what's needed, what I would add to that from our longer readings of the subject, is a return to the history of reform. We have not talked about reform, we have not spoken about reform and reformers in the context of the 19th century without the lens of pessimism attached for quite some time. And just finding a couple examples of reform and reformers who weren't totally wrong, who were totally full of their privilege, just finding a couple of examples, how is that done right? You know, from sewerage reform or air pollution reform or any case in the 19th century city is very interesting. It's a challenge.
Just to pick up on one thing which quite amused me, which is that our experience in history and policy about how to get historians listened to by policymakers and so on is our sort of prime product is what we call a policy paper, which is 4,000 words maximum, no footnotes allowed, no jargon allowed, bullet points at the start, etc., to try to make it very easy and accessible to people who probably aren't trained historians but are highly intelligent, policy-interested people. And we have one or two very important rules, and one of them is that you, as a historian, you are not allowed to conclude your policy paper with the statement, so it's all much more complicated. We say that you have to stick your neck out and select a particular policy tractable specific proposal to offer from your piece of history. And that's something that, you know, goes against the grain for historians, but that's the deal. And, you know, 150 different historians have taken that and they've accepted it. And of course, you know, we know that they would dearly love to say and, but we say, no, you've got to just restrict yourself to this one or two specific points. You may not even entirely believe them because, you know, but you are not going to get policy people to read this thing unless they've got something to take away. And, you know, you've got to offer it.
A couple of quick questions to wind up from the... No, there's always more than two. Gentleman in the blue shirt, you were first. And then I'm afraid I'm going to take the young lady. Sorry to describe you that way. The woman in the second, third row.
Good evening, and thank you for a very stimulating talk. My name is Jim Moher. I'm a former trade union official and actually associated with the History and Policy Forum because basically, looking at things from a trade union perspective, we're in a jam. We'd like to get some answers from history. But the point Simon was making particularly took me. There was a time when historians were taken very serious. And I'm thinking particularly of not just Adam Smith, but David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill, when they were in fact political economists. And it may be that economists have got the inside track now. Would it be the case that historians should maybe team up with economists and perhaps go back to the term political economist, which is integrally connected with history?
Thank you. Can you pass the microphone across? I think this is going to have to be the last question.
Hi. Good evening. Thank you for your talk. First of all, I'm a prospective history student. I take AS at the moment, so just beginning. And my question is, do you think historians should step forward not just to advise, but to become policymakers? And should this new change be driven by people like myself who are just coming through and considering going into history in university terms and future terms?
Thank you.
Sorry, what was your name?
Morwenna, sorry, I forgot to say.
Do you want to answer that first?
Okay, yeah, sure. Yes, well, when I would highly recommend you to look upon your undergraduate degree in history, if you take it, as a good way to prepare yourself for becoming a policy maker, if that's what you choose to do. I don't, as you would expect me to say, I can't think of a better training. So all power to you, and you go ahead and do that. And there are plenty of politicians who have taken history as their training. You know, not just law and economics. It's a common practice. To Jim, nice to see you, Jim. I think that I mean, as I've mentioned already, there's a subset of history called economic history, which is quite broadly defined nowadays. It addresses problems in economic history, but the methods that are used are often as qualitative as much as quantitative. It embraces cultural and social and intellectual history focused onto the problems of economic history. So I think that there is a whole branch, and it has journals like notably the Economic History Review, where which has been going for 80 years, where historians work with problems that are of direct relevance to economists, but they offer a somewhat different approach to what is today called mainstream economics. But let's not forget, and your question raised it, that economics, in its history, has a number of strands to it. What is currently called mainstream would be more accurately called neoliberal economics, which actually identifies the ideological slant within it. There is Keynesian economics, there's socialist economics, there's Marxist economics, there's classical political economy, which and there is political economy still today. So there are many forms of economics, and one of the really rather interesting questions for historians and others to ask is why this particular variant has become really quite dominant, particularly in Anglo-Saxon societies over about the last 30 or 40 years, and there are a number of historians are working on that and have published on that, and it's clear that the way in which this ascendancy was established is a complex story and a very interesting one, with multiple causality attaching to it. But it also is, I think, a fragile dominance, which certain problems are emerging. The ones that this book, History Manifesto, identifies. All three of them: climate problems, equality, and governance, which I think we can say have been exacerbated by too much reliance on this one model.
I'm going to do this alphabetically, so it's Joe and then David, but can I ask you to be brief, because we need to finish at 8 and the recording will end, and therefore my last word won't be recorded if you go on beyond. So.
About 30 seconds.
Terrific. Well, we wouldn't want that to happen. So I just wanted to say really briefly to Jim, one of the things that we talk about in the book is the history of economists and visualization, how economists teach their ideas. And so the birth of it's helpful to know that the birth of the demand-supply curves that we all know and love, and we're familiar with them as a tool of economic argumentation and reasoning at every level of the economy, that those evolved in the era of the Popular Front as labor economists, Marxist economists, were trying to teach their rank and file about how their wages and how the prices of commodities were set. The visualization was held to be a more efficient way of communicating to large numbers of people without sophisticated training and argumentation. It's succinct, it's portable, you can reproduce it, you can draw it on a chalkboard. And this is very provocative, because we live in the era of big data, and the data can produce a chart. It can produce a chart of dimensions, of words, of concepts, of institutions over time. So if we're in alliance with trade unions, what does that mean for how historians might borrow from the tools of the economists?
David.
Extremely briefly, to Jim, collaboration is essential and enjoyable, as we've discovered writing this book, that two brains, or sometimes more than two brains on a project, are usually much better than one, especially slightly more seriously in relation to the point you made about economists. So many disciplines now, economics, climate science, genomics, cosmology, are becoming more and more historical, but often without direct dialogue with historians. So there are many opportunities for us to engage with other fields and to have other fields to engage with us. And to Morwenna, absolutely, I just agree with Simon that history is the best possible training for any conceivable career. I see it as my job, not just to produce other little professors, though I do that, and I'm very happy to do that, to come back to Draw's question, but to create more historically informed citizens, policymakers, lawyers, accountants, bankers, whatever it may be, who come out of our classrooms. They should have that sense of historical complexity and depth. To quote that great historian who would never have got tenure because he published too little and it wasn't footnoted, Cicero, history is the guide to life, the Magister Vitae.
Thank you. In having the last word, I do have the privilege of doing two things. The first is to thank you all for coming tonight, for your questions and for being part of this conversation about the History Manifesto. And then second, and perhaps a little bit more importantly, is to thank the panelists for leading this discussion. So hopefully you'll join with me in showing your appreciation for Joe, for David, and for Simon for their